So good evening. Welcome to our lecture recital presentation this evening. I am Becky Ostermann. I'm the music director here at Our Lady of Lourdes Church. And I'm also a student at the University of South Carolina in their doctoral program in choral conducting. Tonight we're just going to make a small study and then perform you a part of a little known work, the oratorio, Durchzug, durchs, Rote, which means the passing through the Red Sea. Johann Hummel is the composer of the work. The work is from the early 19th century, but it is new in that it has been performed only a few times. It seems that the oratorio was not performed during Hummel's lifetime, or at all, until 2004. Since 2004, it has been performed several times in Europe, but never in the United States, to the best of my knowledge. So when you hear it tonight, it'll be your first performance in the US. It's exciting. The autograph manuscript for this piece is held in the London British Library. In this lecture titled Religious Theater, Secular Elements in the Oratorio, Durchzug, durchs, Rote, Meer, we will become just a little more familiar with Hummel as a theater musician, strongly influenced by stage music. And we will also become generally familiar with his only oratorio, and we'll study in particular how Hummel borrowed from secular music while he composed it. The oratorio genre is considered a type of sacred music, but it has also been nicknamed unstaged opera. So an oratorio, strictly speaking, is a multi-movement work with a sung story, which is like an opera. Only in an oratorio, it's a religious story, it's usually biblical. But like an opera, an oratorio contains recitatives, it has choruses, it has arias, usually has some instrumental numbers, so that's the same as opera. But an oratorio as a sacred genre usually retains some strictures and decorum that is more suitable for performance in the church. For example, an oratorio doesn't have staging, it doesn't have costumes, there are no sets, there's no stage acting. It's just the concert performance of the music. Also in an oratorio, the solo writing would be a little less flamboyant than you might hear in an opera aria. It's just a little toned down for an oratorio. Hummel, however, draws on his background and he takes his oratorio quite far in the direction of unstaged opera. He makes a sort of religious stage sets or anything like that. Oratorio's music from this vantage point and lay out 5 in which the music of Hummel's oratorio borrows from or is influenced by secular music, especially by opera. So we're going to begin just with a brief introduction to Hummel himself. I have a little timeline for you there. Hummel was Austro-Hungarian. Musically, he belongs to the Viennese tradition, which is the same school of music as Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, all of those composers. He was a pianist in his time. He was also a composer of both secular and sacred music, and he was a conductor, especially in particular a conductor of opera and of stage works. Hummel lived from 1778 until 1837, and this is the end of the classical era into the beginning of the romantic era in music. So by way of context, which you can see on the slide there, his lifespan closely matches that of Beethoven, who was a good friend of his. Also of Niccolo Paganini, who was the virtuosic violinist who kind of redefined what virtuosity means. And also of the opera composer, Gioacchino Rossini. He's on the slide because Hummel performed a lot of his operas. They were the newest operas of the day, and so that's what Hummel would be performing when he was conducting operas. He also conducted a lot of Mozart operas and Haydn operas, everything that was live at the time he was working. You can also see that Hummel lines up with the later years of Haydn and Mozart. So he was contemporary with those classical composers, but the end of his life Also lines up with the early careers of the Romantic composers, so you see him lining up there with Robert Schumann and Franz Liszt. So he's right in between, he's right in the cracks there. Hummel studied with Mozart and was deeply steeped in all of the repertoire of the classical era. He performed piano works from the classical era, he conducted operas, masses, motets, oratorios, all of this from his musical fathers. Throughout most of his career, Hummel held some court position as a conductor and a composer. His first court position he got in 1803, he was 25, and it was at the Esterhazy court in Eisenstadt in position. So he's one of Haydn's successors directly. Haydn's principal job at Eisenstadt was to renew the theatrical life of the court at the Esterhazy family castle. He produced a full schedule of operas and other musical stage works for the court, and he composed several operas himself, as well as Singspiels, ballets, pantomimes, and incidental music for stage plays. He did not head the church music division at the court, but his position at Eisenstadt still provided the circumstances and the opportunity to compose sacred music. He wrote 5 masses, which were to the great tradition of Haydn's masses for the Esterhazys. They had one composed every year, so Hummel took that up after Haydn retired and wrote them 5 masses. He also has 7 or 8 motets, small sacred works. He wrote a Te Deum, about 10 cantatas, 3 large secular works for chorus and orchestra. The one oratorio you will hear tonight, Der Durchzug, durchs Rote. So even though Hummel was not a church musician at Eisenstadt or in any of his court positions throughout his whole career, his sacred choral compositions were known and they were performed in Germany, in England, and in France. And they were universally acclaimed in all of those countries during and after his lifetime as some of his finest works and his most enduring works. There's a little bit of perspective on Hummel as a choral composer and as principally a theater musician. We'll look more closely now at the oratorio itself. There it is in its autographed manuscript. The oratorio's topic, as you can tell from the title, is the biblical story of Moses and the deliverance of the Israelites from Egypt through the 10 plagues and the parting of the Red Sea. It's about 53 minutes long, which is rather short for an oratorio. It's about the same length as Beethoven's oratorio, though, so it's not unusual. It has 13 numbers, and is scored for typical classical orchestra. So there's flute, oboes, clarinets, horns, trumpet and timpani, a string section, and a keyboard, which at the time was a pianoforte. There are 10 named character roles for soloists. We'll hear 5 of them tonight. And there's a chorus that takes on character roles as well, like the chorus in a Bach Passion would. So sometimes they play a choir of Israelites, and sometimes they are representing a choir of heavenly spirits, as it says in the score. But besides this usual instrumentation, Hummel also includes 3 unusual instruments for the time. There's a guitar in the piece, a harp in the piece, and a bass drum in the piece. The harp and the bass drum were used commonly in the Romantic era. As we move forward, the guitar is unusual for quite some time. So that's just an overview of the work. So tonight we're going to focus on the five musical elements in the oratorio that are derived from secular forms. And there are, you can see them there, and we'll follow along. The instrumentation, guitar, and the bass drum. Polytextual ensemble number. It's number 9. We'll look at more closely what that is as we go forward. But basically it means there are 4 different texts that are sung simultaneously by 4 characters. And we'll consider why that's significant. The third way is the similarity of number 1, which is the opening instrumental number in the work, to an opera overture. It's similar in 3 ways, both in the way that it's structured and content, so we'll look at that. Fourth way is the fugues, which are interrupted in a very unusual fashion with material from the previous aria. We'll talk about that as well. And the last one is the oratorio contains operatic solo material in the form of a color through a soprano aria. So we'll look at that one by one. First, we're going to look at the instrumentation here. The guitar. The guitar is featured in number 9 as a solo instrument with the orchestral accompaniment. It plays in a light arpeggiation, and it introduces the soloist. The playing style that's used by the guitar in the opening of number 9 is the same style that was used to accompany secular songs in recitals at the time in Vienna. So it's playing in a secular style to accompany the singing. The guitar recitals were quite popular in Vienna at this time. But Hummel includes the guitar for dramatic reasons, not for popularity reasons. So maybe there was some crossover here. Number 8, the number that precedes this, ends with the text, and they quote, "They celebrated the Passover with horns, citterns, the sound of harps and flutes," and so on. The guitar represents the cittern that's mentioned in the text there. So number 9 features solos not only for the guitar, but also for the horns, the harp, and the flute that are also mentioned in that text. So Hummel wraps in all 4 of those instruments and gives a complete musical representation of that ending number 8 text. So that's why the guitar is there. The horns and the flutes that also have solos in the number, these are usual, they're typical to the classical orchestra, nothing unusual there, even in sacred music. The harp is less usual, so Hummel is on the front edge of using the harp here. On the Romantic era after this time. But the guitar is striking. It was not used in sacred music at the time, certainly, but it also did not appear with the orchestra at all until 1808, when very popular guitarist Mauro Giuliani in Vienna presented a guitar concerto that he composed with orchestra. And it was deemed entirely inappropriate by the critics of the day. They thought the guitar had no place with the orchestra at all. It's fun to read the commentary in the old periodicals about these things. So that guitar is significant for 3 reasons. It's a secular instrument, and it's in a religious work, and it's deliberately playing in a secular style, a song accompaniment style. It's also there to illustrate the drama, so it's a dramatic feature, and it's groundbreaking from a compositional point of view. The guitar didn't play with the orchestra before this. The bass drum there is the other secular instrument used in this religious work. In fact, it is featured in the Angel of Death's aria, which is number 7 in the oratorio. And it seems to be representing the death itself. It's a very little, dull sound. And it plays just separate dull strokes throughout the aria. And at the end of the aria, it has a bass drum roll. The bass drum roll in Der Durchzug is also a compositional innovation like the guitar was. It seems to be the first great bass drum roll ever composed, preceding Franz Liszt's, which is currently listed in the Rote dictionary. This preceded Franz Liszt's by at least 12 years. He gets credit from Liszt on that point. The bass drum, then, like the guitar, has threefold interest for us. It is a secular instrument used in religious work. It is there for theatrical reasons, and it is revolutionary from a compositional point of view for this time in history. So that's the instrumentation. We're going to look next at that polytextual ensemble. Polytextualism is layering of multiple texts that are sung simultaneously. In this case, those 4 texts are sung by 4 different characters, and each text belongs specifically to the character who sings it. No other characters ever sing that character's text. They keep themselves distinct. So when the soloists then are singing as a quartet together, each of them is singing his own text, so that all 4 texts are being sung at the same time. I'll show you that to you here. There are the 4 soloists. And although the lower 3 are kind of moving together musically, you can see the print large enough. They're each singing a different line in German. Why is this significant? The point of this is to keep the individual thoughts and the identity of each character separate from each other while they interact. Several of Mozart's opera ensembles are models of this kind of polytextual playing technique. The trio Susanna or Sophia's Mortite from Mozart's Les Danses Figaro is a very well-known example of a dynamic polytextual ensemble number in which each character has their completely different train of thought, but they're all singing at the same time. Hummel surely knew about this technique from the operas he conducted. He conducted a lot of Mozart. I just want to add, if you are musically astute, you will notice that the classical mass also overlapped text. It's called text telescoping. It happens in the Gloria or the Credo of the Mass. You have different voice parts, not solos, just different voice parts, all singing different pieces of the Gloria or Credo text at the same time. But the point is entirely different. The point of text telescoping in the classical Mass, Missa Brevis, short Mass, is to make the Mass shorter. And so it's not for dramatic purposes, it's to get through the long text of the Gloria or the Credo as quickly as possible. So that's a different reason for doing that than in the opera ensembles. It's a dramatic reason in an opera ensemble. So this is borrowing from the opera ensemble technique, such as Mozart had, and that's why this style of text is significant. It's a secular style here. The third influence of the secular on the oratorio here is in number 1. Number 1 is similar to an opera overture. It's an instrumental opening number. Hummel calls it the entrada, which means the entrance. The fact that there is an opening instrumental number is not unusual, and that's not a secular influence. Most oratorios do have an opening instrumental number. Hummel's entrada is like an opera overture in 3 ways. First, it has a structure of an opera reprise overture. Reprise overture has 3 parts: fast part, slow part, and fast part. This also is not uncommon, but what makes it different and what attaches it to the opera overture in particular is that the second fast part is not the same as the first fast part. So it's not an A-B-A structure, it's an A-B-C structure. ABC is a narrative form, it's a dramatic form. This is the basic form of Hummel's entrada, and it's up there on the screen there, the fast, the slow, the fast, but they are all different. Second way that the opening number is like an overture is in that it previews musical themes that are found later in the oratorio's body. This was very common in opera overtures at the time, beginning in 1767 with Gluck's Alceste, continuing on certainly through the Mozart operas, and eventually forming a standard practice for the opera overture. If you think of Gazette's overture to Carmen, which was written in 1875, quite a bit later, this is a famous example. You hear the March of the Toreadors a little bit in the overture, and then you hear it in full in the opera itself. So it's a preview in the overture. Hummel in the oratorio entrada briefly introduces a rocket theme that you'll be heard in full in number 9. But even more significantly, he recasts the entire concept of the Angel of Death's aria, which is number 7, in the middle of the entrada. So you can see this here. The line there is the tenor aria, tenor voices in the middle there. And on the bottom of the slide is its foreshadowing that comes from the number 1 adagio. So we're going to hear a little bit of this. We're going to start by hearing just the tenor voice, so you can hear the basic structure of the tenor solo. And then we'll hear the oboe's version of that, which is an ornamented melodic line that's based on the tenor solo. So the tenor solo, you can see it on the screen there, the first three notes. It's a C, a G, and a C. It's very triadic. And then the oboe solo underneath, after the little flourish in the first bar, the main note there, the half note, is a C, and the follow up to that G. And then there's an octave drop, another G, the lower one. The octave is also featured heavily in the tenor solo. So it's kind of condensed, C, G, and octave drop. So I'm going to ask Stephen, our tenor solo, opening piece of the tenor solo, and then we'll compare it with So you can hear there the octave drops, and you can see the opening, the C, CGC. So let's hear the oboe solo version of that. It's decorated, but the structure is the same. Yoni's going to play that for us on the keyboard. Okay, so if that's not convincing enough, there are other ways in which these things are similar. If you look at the bass line in both of the examples there on the screen, you'll see it, bass line rocks back and forth in a third pattern. In fact, it's the same third pattern for quite a ways. So the bass accompaniment is the same for both of these. And the violin part, the string part that you see there, it's on the top in the top example, and it's in the middle in the bottom example. You can see they're both very active. So this fluttery violin part going on in both of those. Both examples are also cast in the same key, they're both in C minor. Also, which you cannot see on the musical example, in the entrada adagio, number one's adagio, the foreshadowing, there's a timpani that plays every so often at intermittent blows. And that is a foreshadowing of number seven's bass drum, which also plays in intermittent blows. So the whole texture is it's very similar when you hear it put together. You're going to hear number 7 tonight in our performance. So this adagio oboe solo section that's in the middle of the entrada is a very masterful and extensive application of the opera overture technique of previewing themes from the body of the opera in the overture. The number 1 suggests an opera overture in a third way. After the entrada has properly ended with an extended and very obvious final cadence, loud full orchestra. There's a pause, and then Hummel adds 16 more bars of music. It's soft music, it's agitated strings, it kind of floats around, doesn't come to a solid conclusion. So these 16 bars after the apparent final cadence of the entrada, they're totally uncalled for from a musical perspective. The entrada was over with the large cadence. So what are these additional 16 bars of scattered motifs for? We're going to hear them in a minute. These extra bars sound very much like theatrical entrance music, which occupies the time around we're going to prepare to sing the opening number. So they're a transition into the onset of the drama, the beginning of the opera or the stage work, as it may be. And this happens right before the chorus will sing number 2, which is the first sung music in the oratorio. So we're going to perform a little piece of this. You're going to hear the end, the big end of the entrada. Then there's a pause, and there's the little string motifs that we're not quite sure what they're doing or why they're happening after the entrada seems to end. And then you hear the chorus begin their opening number. So you can hear it set up the entrance of the chorus like entrance music would in a stage work. And then they'll continue to hurry up. That's a little short demo there. How that transition works. Lettering violin section in the middle. Of the 5 ways in which the oratorio is influenced by secular music. The interrupted fugues. There are 2 fugues in the oratorio, number 4, 8. Both of them come to a complete pause near the end of the fugue, and then the fugue process is interrupted, and you hear a section from the aria that preceded the fugue. So there's a piece of aria stuck in the middle of the fugue. Then the fugue resumes and finishes. So in the case of number 4, 8, the fugue progresses about 3/4 of the way through. Then it stops on a monumental cadence, big fermata there. It's full orchestra and the choir singing. And then the bass soloist enters singing the role of Moses. He's singing a segment of the aria that we will have heard just earlier, aria number 4. And the chorus joins him in the same way that it did in the aria. Instrumental accompany is nice and light, like it was in the aria. And then the fugue restarts abruptly, and the fugue finishes. It's the same idea in number 13A, which is the other fugue in the work. Same process, like it inserts a section of the aria of Moses from number 13. The fugue is very common in sacred music. And by the classical era, it was understood that a fugue belonged properly to sacred music. So the fact of a fugue is not secular at all. But at least I do not know of any other fugue in the repertoire that is interrupted in this fashion. This is a very theatrical gesture, and you can think of it in terms of film, modern day film. Say you have the World War II movie, and you have a big victory scene, and there's crowds and confetti and all of that happening. This is kind of like the fugue, it's a big celebration by the entire chorus. And then you have the film, the director focus in on one character, and you see just that character's perspective for a minute. It's very personal, it's very dramatic way of picturing that victory celebration. And then it goes back and you have the whole crowd again. So that's kind of what's happening in the middle of this fugue, with the focus suddenly on the single character on Moses. So you'll get to hear that tonight. We're going to perform all through that number 4, number 4A, so you hear it in real life and see how you respond to that yourself. But it does seem truly unique to Hummel. Again, I don't know of any other instance of this. Okay, so the last way in which we have borrowing from the secular is the coloratura soprano aria. It's number 11 in the work. The coloratura style includes very rapid and virtuosic passage work in a very high range. It's designed to show off the singer. Mozart's famous Queen of the Night aria from the Magic Flute, which perhaps many of you know. This is an earlier coloratura model from an opera. Certainly, Hummel conducted this opera many times. The style, the coloratura style, does not belong to sacred or religious music. And it is true that there are some quite challenging and colorful solos that you will hear in masses or motets from this time. But in those cases, the solo lines are normally double pipe instruments, so that the soloist does not become completely independent. and can't make such a spectacular display as the soprano soloist is going to in this solo. An excerpt from the color tour aria that we'll hear tonight. You can see the fast passage work there. It's in cut time to each of the bars. It's moving quite quickly. Goes up to the high D flat, has a double trill with an ornament in the middle. We're not going to demonstrate this right now because we'll get to hear it at the end of our performance. But you can see Hummel's color tour writing as compared to Mozart's. Hummel's is more romantic in its scope. Longer, it's more complex, and it requires a greater variety of feats from the singer. So it's clearly and fully operatic, has no concern whatsoever for religious decor. All this, and let's review it a little bit. You have the oratorio, Durchzug, durchs, Rote, Meer. It's influenced by secular music, probably due to Hummel's immersion in the music of the theater. This work employs, we remember, secular instruments in the guitar and bass drum. Begins with an instrumental number that is similar to an opera overture in those three ways, including the construction as a reprise overture, the references to themes that are heard later in the oratorio, foreshadowed in the opening instrumental number, and also in those mysterious 16 bars that serve as entrance music for the chorus. In number 9, we have the quartet singing in that polytextual fashion, their own personal texts all wound together as they would be in an opera ensemble. We have the fugues, 4A and 13A, that have the dramatic insertion of material from the arias that go with them. And then lastly, we have the coloratura soprano aria. Style's unmistakable, so you'll catch it when it happens. So with all that said, Hummel's oratorio does remain an oratorio. It's a true oratorio. It's not defying the definition of the genre. But it is clearly innovative, and it is clearly influenced by the secular. So the result is very colorful and engaging religious drama. It's a reflection of Hummel himself, if you understand him as the musician that he was, which was principally a theater conductor, as well as a virtuosic concert performer. He was a late classical and early romantic composer. He composed many genres of music. Since shortly after his death, Hummel has been accused for about a century and a half of being pedantically classical. And for that century and a half, he was largely ignored for this reason. He was considered backward-looking. But in this work, at least, Hummel brought his own musical identity to that transitional period between the classical era and the romantic era. And he did develop a classical style beyond the standard of his predecessors, from where he was in his own place and time. Just like the early romantics proceeded forward from wherever they were in their place and time. So my hope with this research is and with our live performance tonight, is that this will increase interest in Hummel's choral works, especially, but on their own terms. I think it is a mistake to judge Hummel's work for what it is not, which is what has been happening for the last 150 years. It is not full-blown romanticism. Bach's work isn't either, and neither is Mozart's. But instead, we have to judge Hummel's oratorio for what it is. It's a progressive extension of the classical style. It's inventive, it's coherent, it's musically thoughtful, it's very well constructed, it's continuous, and hopefully you will find it. So I just want to thank you so much for following through this presentation with me. Just to get familiar with Hummel's work from this one angle. We're going to take just a minute to prepare for the performance. Take us maybe 3 minutes. and then we'll sing it for you. Thank you so much.
Des Nachts auf einem
want to thank you so much again for coming tonight. We have a reception afterwards in Ivy Hall. It's just down the street, a couple of doors. If you follow the crowd, you knows where it is, and you'll find it. It's just a little way. I also want to mention a few people by name who have helped with this project. This project has really been an ensemble work. One of my choristers said to me before we were setting up tonight that I was the most important person here. I'm actually the least important person here because they can sing that without me, but I can sing it without them. So I want to thank all, especially the singers in the chorus, most of whom are volunteers. They spent many evenings in the past 3 weeks together to prepare this work for tonight. So if we had a stronger version of thank you, that's what I would use for them. But thank you very much. Also want to thank my Recital crew, our brother and we're down here. Michael Cannon was here most of the day yesterday and today, helping set things up, as well as the Milani family. There's about 5 people whose equipment we borrowed, so thank you to all of you. And since this is not only the end of this lecture recital, it's also the end of my doctoral degree. I just need to mention a few more people. This has been a 5-year process for me, and people have been helping me over those 5 years. Principally, our late and beloved pastor, Father Michael Rock, who was instrumental in my being able to pursue at all. And also all of the people, too many to mention, who have helped me in various ways over the last years, especially while I was in South Carolina to do residency and straddling Columbia and Philadelphia in order to remain here at Durchs. And I'm so glad you're here tonight. I can't think of a place I would rather be standing while I finish, or a group of people I would rather be with. So thank you all so very much. And again, thank you to all of our musicians tonight. And hopefully I will see you across the street or down the street at the hall. Very good. Thank you.
In the street.